Hello. In this short video, I'm going to talk to you about t-tests and what they mean, how they work. And there's also a document that will teach you how to run a t-test using your graphing calculator. You're going to be using that to actually make your calculations. But this video is just a simple video to think about what the results mean. So I'm going to open up a document on Excel. And I've got a lot of data here, and I just want to show you the graph that I'm showing you. So in this particular example, I decided to compare the length and the width of different plants, of plant cells. And I was measuring length and width in millimeters. And so I measured 6 plant cells, and I measured their length. And I measured 6 plant cells' widths. Different plant cells, but these are the same species. I was looking at a species called Elodea. Elodea is a small plant that lives in water that you might have in a fish tank. And I decided, I thought it was interesting that the cells seem to be rectangle shaped, seem to be kind of long and skinny. And I was interested in comparing the mean length to the mean width to just get a feeling for, are these two groups different from each other? Are Elodea cells really actually longer than they are wide? Are they rectangle shaped, in other words? And so I calculated, for my length sample, I calculated a mean, and for my width sample, I calculated a mean size. And then I calculated the variation around the mean as my standard deviation. So that's what's going on in this box over here on the left. And then I plotted the data so I could look at the data a little bit better. So I looked at mean size plus or minus the standard deviation in millimeters for my length sample and my width sample. And these are, you can see that this mean is, almost, well, it might be exactly 0.4 millimeters. And the width sample is less than 0.1 millimeters. And there's our variation, lots of variation in the length sample. Okay, and so when I look at this, I can say, wow, it sure looks like these cells are longer than they are wide, right? But if I were going to publish this little graph somewhere, the editors of the journal that I was trying to publish it in would not be happy with me if I said, yeah, I calculated the means of these two groups, and I decided, just by looking at them, that they sure look different. It looks like the length sample is much longer than the width sample. So it must be that, that these cells are longer than they are wide. The journal editor would not be happy. When we are really analyzing our data, it helps us to use inferential statistics to help us draw conclusions about our data, to give us more confidence in the conclusions that we're drawing. So if I ask the question, are the means of these two groups different? I probably shouldn't answer that question unless I've done some sort of statistical test to help me draw that conclusion. I mean, they kind of look different to me, but I don't know for sure. Maybe the differences we see are just due to chance. I mean, I only measured 6 cells of each type, right? So I need to have something that gives me a little more backbone when I draw my conclusions, when I can be like, yes, I've done some statistical analysis, and sure enough, these two groups are different, right? Okay, so I want to find out if the means of these two groups are different. If in fact the mean cell length is bigger than the mean cell width. And I need to do a statistical test to help me draw that conclusion. The test that allows you to compare the means of two groups is called a t-test. There are different kinds of t-tests. There are independent t-tests and paired t-tests. I'm going to be using an independent t-test because I worked with different cells. 6 cells I looked at length, and 6 different cells I looked at width. So they're independent of each other, these two groups. And what this test does, you can do it by hand, but it's a nightmare. Don't do that. Use your graphing calculator. Follow the instructions on the worksheet to use your graphing calculator to calculate a value. It gives you a t-value that is really a way that compares all of the data to the mean, okay? And then you can compare essentially the means of these two groups and ask the question, are these two groups different from each other? Are the means of these two groups significantly different from each other? And so what the t-test does, it is, if I run it, and I ran the t-test for these data, I had to put in all of my data for length and all of my data for width. And what it does is it pops out a t-test t-value of, in this case, 4.79. It also pops out, or also, you also need to know what's called the degrees of freedom, and you also will find out the p-value once you've got a t-value. The t-value could range, all right? The bigger the t-value, the bigger the differences between these two groups. So a t-value of 0 would say, ooh, these two groups are very, very similar in size. But the bigger the t-value is, the more different these two groups are from each other. Well, I don't know if a t-value of 4.79 is big or small, though. That's when the p-value comes in very handy. The p-value is the probability that the differences you see between the two groups, it's the probability that the differences we see are due to chance. Now, there are always going to be differences between two groups because of sample size and just because of variation. But are the differences between these two groups just due to chance or sampling error, or is there something real happening here? The p-value helps us decide that. My p-value is very, very small. What that tells me is there is a very small probability that the differences between these two groups are just due to chance. P of 0.001 means there is a 0.1% probability that the differences we see between my two groups are due to chance. That's very small. Statisticians like to tell you that if the p-value is less than 5% or less than 0.05, you can say that, the differences between these two groups are probably not due to chance alone. There's probably something real and meaningful going on here. And so they would say these two groups are statistically different from each other or significantly different from each other if the p-value is less than 0.05. If the p-value is very big, if the p-value is like 0.8 or 0.1 or 0.9 or 0.06 even, that means that there's some pretty significant probability that the differences we see are just due to chance. So if our p-value is greater than 0.05, we would say, the differences here could be due to chance. So I am not going to conclude that these two groups are statistically different. For my particular study, I can be quite confident, because my p-value is very small, that the differences I saw between the length and the width samples are significant, are not just due to chance. It looks like there are real differences here, right? So I could say that there is a significant difference between cell length and cell width. The mean of length and width groups are significantly different. That's another way to say it. So I'm pretty happy that I can make this conclusion based on my data. The t-test helped me make a more confident conclusion. I have one more thing to add here. You also have to report the degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom is equal to the number the number of groups minus 1. So we have two groups that we're studying, length and width. Minus 1 is equal to 1. So this is a pretty easy degrees of freedom in this case. That just it helps us identify the p-value when we're looking at a chart. We need to know the t-value and the degrees of freedom. And once we know those two things, we can sort out what the p-value is, or the probability that the differences we see are just due to chance alone. So for this particular study, I'm pretty happy. I can say pretty confidently that because the t-value is big and the p-value is so small, less than 0.05, that these two groups, length and width, are significantly different from each other. The means are different from each other. And you'll have to do that with some data that you collect in lab for exercise 3. So I hope this video helps you. Thanks.